December 24th, 1944. The jungles of Leyte Island, Philippines. The war had no end. Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka sat in a foxhole that smelled of mud and decay and tried to remember what silence sounded like. Real silence. Not this, the constant buzz of insects, the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle, the sound of men breathing in the dark who might not be breathing by morning. He was 21 years old. He had been fighting for 18 months. The jungle had consumed everything: his sense of time, his certainty about the future, his ability to imagine a world where men did not kill each other over strips of land that no one would remember the names of in 100 years. Around him, what remained of his unit huddled in position scraped from the earth with entrenching tools in bare hands. 11 men. They had been 43 when they landed on this island. The rest were dead or missing, or had simply walked into the jungle one day and never returned, choosing madness or desertion over the slow, grinding certainty of death by bullet or disease or starvation. The Americans were everywhere now. Their numbers endless, their supplies infinite, their advance methodical and inevitable as a rising tide. Every day brought more of them. Every night brought the sound of their artillery, the scream of their planes, the knowledge that tomorrow would be worse than today. Tanaka's hands shook as he checked his rifle for the 100th time, not from fear, though fear was there, constant and familiar as his own heartbeat, but from hunger. They had not received supplies in 3 weeks. The rice was gone. The dried fish was gone. They ate roots and insects and anything that could be chewed and swallowed. Some of the men had stopped eating entirely, their bodies shutting down, their eyes going distant and empty. Tanaka knew this look. He had seen it before. It was the look of men who had decided to die, who had made the calculation that continuing to fight, to struggle, to pretend that survival was possible, it required more energy than they possessed.
But he was not ready to die. Not yet. Not while some small, stubborn part of him still believed that he might see Japan again, might see his mother and sister, might stand in his father's shop and smell sawdust and lacquer, and all the ordinary smells of a life that seemed now like something from a dream. The Americans were close tonight, maybe 200 meters away, across a small ravine that separated the two lines, close enough that Tanaka could hear them sometimes. Voices speaking that harsh, angular language, the clank of equipment, the sound of engines. They had everything: food and ammunition and medical supplies and reinforcements. They fought from a position of overwhelming material superiority, and they knew it. They did not need to be clever or desperate. They just needed to keep pushing forward, keep bringing more men and more metal, keep grinding down the Japanese positions until nothing remained. Tanaka hated them with a purity that surprised him sometimes. He had not been particularly patriotic before the war. He had been a carpenter's son, apprenticed to his father, learning to shape wood into useful things. He had never wanted to be a soldier, but the war had found him anyway, had pulled him from his ordinary life and deposited him here, in this green hell, killing men he did not know, for reasons that had stopped making sense months ago. And in the absence of meaning, he had found hate. It was simpler than doubt, cleaner than fear. It gave structure to the chaos, purpose to the suffering. The Americans were the enemy. They wanted to destroy Japan, to humiliate the emperor, to remake the world according to their values. Killing them was righteous. Dying while killing them was honorable. This was the story he told himself to make the days bearable. But tonight, something was different. The sun had set an hour ago, and the jungle had gone dark in that absolute way it did when clouds covered the moon. Tanaka could barely see his own hands. The darkness was total, oppressive, almost physical. He listened to the night sounds, insects and distant artillery, and the breathing of his comrades, and waited for whatever came next. An attack, perhaps. The Americans sometimes attacked at night, using their superior equipment, their night vision devices, their flares that turned darkness into day. Or perhaps nothing would happen. Perhaps they would simply sit here until morning, and then the shelling would start again, and more men would die, and the line would move back another 50 meters, and it would all continue exactly as it had continued for weeks and months, with no end in sight. Then, he heard something that made no sense. Singing. It came from across the ravine, from the American positions. Male voices, multiple voices, harmonizing. Not loud, not aggressive or mocking. Just singing. The sound drifting through the darkness like smoke, clear and strange and impossible. Tanaka froze, his rifle halfway to his shoulder, his mind struggling to process what he was hearing. The Americans were singing, in the middle of a war, on Christmas Eve. Though he did not know it was Christmas Eve, had lost track of Western holidays, had barely been able to keep track of his own calendar in the endless sameness of jungle warfare.
The song was in English. He did not understand the words, but he understood the melody. It was simple, repetitive, almost hypnotic, slow and solemn, with a quality that felt old, ancient, like something that had existed long before this war and would exist long after. The voices rose and fell in gentle waves, and there was something in the singing that was not martial, not triumphant, but sad, achingly, unbearably sad. Tanaka listened. Around him, his comrades listened. No one spoke. No one moved. They sat in their foxholes in the darkness and listened to their enemies sing, and the listening felt like something forbidden, like witnessing something not meant for them, like trespassing in a space that existed outside the normal rules of war. The song continued for maybe 2 minutes, maybe 3. Time felt strange, elastic. Tanaka was aware of his heart beating, of sweat running down his ribs despite the cool of the evening, of the weight of his rifle in his hands. He was aware that he should probably do something, call out a warning, prepare for an attack. Assume this was some kind of psychological warfare, some trick designed to lower their guard, but he did none of these things. He simply listened. And as he listened, something shifted inside him. Not dramatically, not in a way he could have articulated if asked, but he felt it. A crack in the armor of hate he had constructed. A moment of confusion that destabilized everything. The Americans were singing, not war songs, not aggressive chants designed to intimidate or demoralize. They were singing something that sounded like prayer, like grief, like homesickness compressed into melody. They were singing like men who missed something, who were far from home, who were tired and afraid, and human in exactly the ways Tanaka was tired and afraid and human. The song ended. The silence that followed was different than the silence before. Heavier, more complex. Tanaka could hear his own breathing, could hear the breathing of the men around him. No one spoke. What would they say? What words existed for this moment? For the cognitive dissonance of hearing beauty emerge from the throats of men you were supposed to kill, of being moved by something created by the enemy, of feeling a connection to people who wanted you dead. Corporal Yamada, who was in the foxhole next to Tanaka's, made a sound. Not quite a word, just a soft exhalation that might have been wonder or confusion or pain. He had been a music teacher before the war. He had taught children to play the koto, to appreciate the traditional melodies of Japan. Now he sat in the mud with a rifle and listened to Americans sing, and his face, barely visible in the darkness, held an expression that Tanaka could not read but understood completely. Minutes passed.
the jungle settled back into its normal sounds. Insects, distant artillery, the rustle of wind in leaves. But something had changed. The night felt different. The war felt different. Not less real, not less dangerous, but somehow less absolute, less total, less like the only truth that mattered. Tanaka thought about the men across the ravine. He had never thought of them as individuals before. They were just Americans, an undifferentiated mass of enemy soldiers, targets, obstacles between himself and survival. But now he could not help imagining them. Young men like himself, probably. Farm boys and factory workers pressed into service, pulled from ordinary lives and deposited in this green hell to kill and die for reasons that probably had stopped making sense to them too. Men who sang because it was Christmas Eve, because they missed home, because music was something that reminded them they were still human, despite everything the war was doing to erase their humanity.
He wondered if they had families, if they had mothers who worried about them, sisters who prayed for them, fathers who had taught them carpentry or farming or some other useful trade that had nothing to do with killing. He wondered if they were hungry like he was hungry, if they were afraid like he was afraid. If they looked at the sky sometimes and wondered how they had ended up here so far from everything they knew, fighting a war that seemed to have no connection to their actual lives. These thoughts were dangerous. He knew this. The moment you started seeing the enemy as human, you made it harder to kill them. And if you could not kill them, you could not survive. That was the logic of war, simple and brutal. Empathy was a luxury. Compassion was weakness. Any recognition of shared humanity was a crack in the armor that would eventually get you killed. He had been taught this in training. He had seen it demonstrated on the battlefield. The soldiers who hesitated, who thought too much, who tried to maintain some connection to the moral universe of peacetime, those died. The soldiers who survived were the ones who turned off that part of themselves, who learned to see the enemy as abstractions, as targets, as problems to be solved rather than people to be understood. But he could not unhear the singing. The night wore on, nothing happened, no attack came, no shells fell. The darkness remained total and absolute. Tanaka sat in his foxhole and tried to recapture the hate he had felt earlier, the clean, simple rage that had made everything clear. But it would not come, or rather, it came mixed with something else now. Doubt, confusion, a terrible awareness that the Americans were not demons or monsters or abstract enemies, but just men, tired and scared and far from home, trying to survive a war they had not chosen any more than he had chosen it. He thought about the song. The melody lingered in his mind, playing over and over like something stuck. He did not know what the words meant, but he knew what the song meant. It meant that the Americans carried with them some cultural practice, some tradition that involved gathering together in the darkness and singing about what? Peace? Probably. Home? Something sacred or at least important enough that they did it even here, even surrounded by enemies, even knowing that showing any vulnerability in war was dangerous. Japan had songs like that too, songs about cherry blossoms and moonlight and the beauty of impermanent things, songs that his mother had sung when he was a child, songs that reminded him that life was fragile and precious and meant to be savored in small moments because large moments were rare and often terrible. He had not thought about those songs in months. The war had pushed them out, had filled his mind with other things, tactics and survival and the constant calculation of threats. But now, listening to the Americans sing their song, he remembered. He remembered that music existed, that beauty existed, that there were things in the world worth preserving besides just your own life. Dawn came slowly. The darkness faded to gray. then to the green, filtered light of the jungle. Tanaka could see across the ravine now, could make out the shapes of American positions, the foxholes and sandbag walls and camouflage netting. He raised his rifle, sighted down the barrel at movement in the enemy line. A soldier, visible for just a moment. Young. Probably his age. Probably one of the men who had been singing last night. Tanaka's finger rested on the trigger. He had the shot. It would be easy. One squeeze. One dead American. One small contribution to the war effort.
He did not fire. Not because he had suddenly become a pacifist, not because he had lost his will to fight, but because something in him needed to wait, needed to hold on to this moment a little longer, needed to exist in the space between hearing the song and returning to the killing. It was a small rebellion, meaningless in the larger scope of the war, but it felt important. It felt like the only choice he could control. The war continued. Of course it continued. Wars did not stop because of songs or moments of doubt, or the sudden awareness that enemies were human. The shelling started an hour after dawn. American mortars, walking their fire across the Japanese positions with mechanical precision. Men died. Tanaka's position took a near hit that left his ears ringing and his uniform covered in mud. The day progressed exactly as every other day had progressed. Violence and terror and the slow grinding attrition of bodies and will. But something had changed, not in the external facts of the war, in Tanaka's internal landscape. He could not go back to the simple certainty he had felt before. The Americans remained the enemy. He would still fight them, still kill them if he had the chance, still do whatever was necessary to survive and protect his comrades, but he could not hate them with the same purity anymore. They had sung. They had revealed themselves as men who missed home, who marked holidays, who carried culture and tradition with them even into hell. And that revelation could not be taken back, could not be forgotten, could not be easily reconciled with the story he had been telling himself about what this war meant and who deserved to die. The days that followed were brutal. The American advance continued. Tanaka's unit fell back, then fell back again. More men died. The island was being lost. Everyone knew it. But they fought anyway because that was what soldiers did. Because surrender was unthinkable, because they had been taught that death was preferable to dishonor, and no one wanted to be the first to break. But sometimes, late at night, Tanaka thought about the singing. He wondered if the Americans sang other nights too, if it was a regular practice, if music helped them maintain their humanity in the face of everything trying to strip it away. He wondered if they thought about the Japanese soldiers listening in the darkness, if they knew they had an audience, if the singing was meant as a message or just as comfort for themselves. He wondered what the words had been, what story the song had told, what meaning it carried for men who grew up in a culture so different from his own. He would never know. The war ended for Tanaka 3 weeks later when shrapnel from an artillery shell tore through his leg and shattered the bone. He woke up in an American field hospital, surrounded by medics who treated him with the same care they gave their own wounded, who gave him morphine for the pain, who cleaned and bandaged his wound with hands that were professional and gentle. He should have felt shame. Capture was disgrace. Survival as a prisoner was cowardice. But he felt only exhaustion and a strange relief that the fighting was over, that he would not have to kill anymore, that he had survived. An American doctor, speaking through a translator, told him his leg would heal, told him he would walk again, told him the war was almost over, that Japan was losing, that soon he could go home. The doctor's face was kind. He could not have been much older than 30. He probably had been a civilian doctor before the war, had probably taken an oath to heal people, and now here he was, healing even his enemies, maintaining his professional ethics in circumstances that might have excused abandoning them.
Tanaka thought about the singing, thought about how the capacity for beauty and the capacity for violence could exist in the same people, in the same army, in the same moment. The Americans had bombed Japanese cities into ash. They had killed hundreds of thousands. They had brought industrial warfare to a scale that made older wars look like skirmishes. But they had also sung in the darkness. They had also fed prisoners. They had also maintained some code of conduct, some belief that even in war there were boundaries, that enemies remained human, that mercy was not weakness but a choice, a deliberate decision to act according to values even when circumstances made it easy to abandon them. This was the paradox that would haunt Tanaka for the rest of his life. The war had taught him to hate. A single song had taught him that hate was not enough, that the world was more complicated than the simple categories of friend and enemy, that the Americans were capable of great destruction and great compassion, often within the same breath, and that this combination was somehow more powerful than either quality alone would have been. He returned to Japan in 1946, emaciated and scarred but alive. His country was in ruins. The cities had been burned. The economy had collapsed. The certainties that had sustained the war effort, the divine emperor, the invincible warrior spirit, the righteousness of the cause, had all been revealed as lies or insufficient truths. Japan had been broken completely, and now had to rebuild not just physically, but philosophically, had to figure out what it meant to be Japanese in a world where Japan had lost, where the old stories no longer worked, where the future was uncertain. Tanaka became a carpenter again, learned to walk with a limp, married, had children, built a quiet life from the wreckage of the war years. He did not talk about his service. Most veterans did not. The war was a shame that Japan carried collectively, a wound too deep to examine directly. But sometimes, late at night, he thought about that Christmas Eve in the jungle, about the American voices singing across the darkness, about the moment when the war had paused just for a few minutes, and something else had emerged, something older than war, something that had to do with the human need to mark sacred time, to create beauty, to reach across the void and say to whoever might be listening, "We are here. We are afraid. We are far from home, but we are still human, still capable of song." He never learned what the song had been, never knew that Silent Night was one of the most famous Christmas carols in the Western world, that it had been sung in trenches during World War I, that it represented a tradition of finding peace and holiness even in the midst of violence. But he understood its meaning anyway, not through translation, but through the feeling it had created in him, the confusion, the crack in certainty, the unwanted recognition that the enemy was not what he had been told, that war was more complex than the propaganda suggested, that humanity persisted even in hell if you listened carefully enough to hear it. Years later, when his children asked him about the war, he told them very little, but he told them this, that once, in the darkest moment he could remember, surrounded by death and suffering and hate, he had heard the enemy sing. And the song had not been about victory or vengeance or any of the things that usually filled the space between armies. It had been about something else, something quiet and sad and impossibly beautiful. And for just a moment, the war had stopped being absolute. For just a moment, there had been room for doubt, for wonder, for the terrible knowledge that the men trying to kill you were also men who sang in the darkness, who missed their homes, who carried beauty with them even into the worst places humans could create.
His children did not understand. How could they? They had grown up in peace, in a Japan that had been rebuilt and transformed, that had chosen a different path. The war was history to them, black and white photographs and old men's stories. They could not imagine what it meant to hate someone completely and then hear them sing and have that hate crack open like cheap pottery, revealing something underneath that was more complicated, more painful, more true. But Tanaka understood. He carried that understanding until the day he died in 1989,
an old man in a country that had become unrecognizable from the one he had fought for. He carried the memory of American voices singing Silent Night across a ravine in the Philippines, carried the knowledge that even in war, even surrounded by enemies, humans sometimes chose to create beauty instead of destruction, harmony instead of chaos, connection instead of division. And in carrying that memory, he carried something else too, the lesson that certainty is dangerous, that the enemy is never as simple as propaganda claims, that the capacity for song exists alongside the capacity for violence, and that the moments when we recognize the humanity of those we are supposed to hate might be the only thing that saves us from becoming monsters ourselves. The war had taught him to kill. A song had taught him that killing was not all there was, that even in the darkest moments, humanity persisted, stubborn and fragile and precious, singing in the darkness because that was what humans did when they needed to remember who they were, what they valued, what they refused to let the war take from them. That was the lesson. That was what the American voices had given him that Christmas Eve in the jungle. Not comfort, not peace, just the knowledge that the world was larger and more complicated than hate, and that sometimes, if you listened carefully enough, you could hear grace even in hell.